to 1983. And the Montauk Project was really an outgrowth of the Cold War because, as your listeners may know, right after World War II, Nazi Germany was finished, but then the U.S. Needed a new threat, and so they devised the Soviet Union as a threat, even though at the time they couldn't even feed themselves in the Soviet Union, so they weren't particularly in a position to attack anybody. And I think that when people realized that, the government of the United States needed a new threat, and that's why in 1947 they came up with the Roswell incident, which your listeners may know, have heard me talk about. It was a staged event. It wasn't a natural event that happened because of a UFO was affected by radar equipment or thunderstorms or whatever they had come up with as a cover story, but actually it was a staged event so that humanity would know that there was an alien presence on the Earth. And, of course, this developed into other things during the 50s and 60s, and eventually there was a need for more types of control, because the Illuminati, or the powers that be, relatively are a small group. Out of the 7 billion people on this planet, the Illuminati are perhaps a couple of 100,000 in total, all the 13 families. And so when you are such a small group that needs to control massive amounts of people, weapons and armies are not enough. Obviously, you could be overwhelmed by the billions. So the most logical thing they did was to create mind control and programming for the general population of the Earth. Now, during World War II, the Germans were very much adept at doing this, and they had practices in the concentration camps and in their own population. Of course, they didn't have any monitors to stop them or regulate them. And so at the end of World War II, they had amassed so much information on programming and mind control that the U.S. government, under Project Paperclip, brought many of those Nazi scientists to the United States, Canada, and Britain in order to continue their experiments and studies without having to go through the Nuremberg trials, etc. And so one of the people that studied this information from the Germans was a Scottish scientist by the name of Dr. Ewan Cameron. And he came to Canada and basically created mind control experiments in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, where he created psychic driving, where he would create extremes for mental patients to break their core personalities into fragments, and then each of those fragments can be programmed into sub-personalities or even alters and constructs within the mind. And I'm making a very long story short. And he was so successful in Canada that in the late 1940s and early 50s, he was brought to the U.S., to the East Coast, and even to the Midwest, where he continued those experiments for the U.S. military and created mind control slaves, which in those days they started to call the females monarchs. And the reason they called them monarchs was named after the monarch butterfly, because they would be like social butterflies going to different sections of society, spying on people, transmitting information, this kind of a thing. And it extrapolated over the decades to quite a vast program of mind control and programming that's pervasive. So that is all a background for Montauk Project. The government needed a space where they could practice this unnoticed, and in those days, in the late 1950s and 1960s, basically they were using SAGE radar in bases, especially along the coasts of the United States, which would pick up allegedly Soviet aircraft that could affect the United States. And as we got towards the mid-60s, these SAGE radar stations became obsolete as new radar equipment was installed. And one of these bases was the Montauk base at the very east end of Long Island, New York. And what made it very unique is that it is really sticking out on a peninsula out into the ocean. There's really only one way to get in and one way to get out, so it's very easily monitored. It happens to be built on a very old military establishment that actually George Washington built in 1799. He built a lighthouse and an underground bunker area for storage in case the U.S. was invaded by the British. And over the centuries, it was added and added and added upon underneath the ground until they eventually broke in to caverns that had previously been existing there for thousands of years. And again, I'll make a long story short, they realized that this building, these technologies that they were finding were Atlantean, and that the Montauk Point was actually the top of a mountain of an archipelago that extended into the Atlantic and Caribbean where Atlantis used to exist. And in fact, geologically, there's only a very thin strip of sand that connects Montauk area to the rest of Long Island. And sometimes in hurricanes and storms it washes away. So in effect, Montauk Point is really an island, top of a mountain that sticks out in the ocean. And the U.S. built, right before World War II, submarine pens underneath this area. And in fact, during World War II, the local people would see German U-boats approaching the coast and submerging, and then leaving days or weeks later, and no one stopped them. And so it was understood at some point that perhaps the U.S. government and the German government in World War II were working together in some categories. In fact, in the town of Amagansett, which is very close to Montauk Point, it was one of the only locations in North America during World War II where the Germans made a beach landing with their military, which most people aren't aware of.
Right.
Yes, and in fact it was discovered afterwards when people on the beach found German rubber rafts and army uniforms that had been left on the beach. Apparently they had changed into civilian clothing and took the train into Manhattan. And eventually they were captured and executed. But it just shows that the Germans felt free enough to come to this area to land because they knew that no one would stop the U-boats in this area. So it's quite an interesting story when you read about it. Now, fast forward again to 1970, when the Montauk Project began underway. It consisted of those German scientists that were brought to the U.S. It also had Russian scientists, Israeli, American, British. There were a lot of major nations that were represented in the Montauk Project. Initially, it was about mind control and programming, yes, but over the years, over those 13 years that it existed, it also was involving genetic manipulation, time travel, esoteric weaponry, interdimensional communication, everything that you can imagine that would involve Tesla equipment and Wilhelm Reich procedures. So it was quite a comprehensive project, and I was there, unfortunately, for the full 13 years that this project existed. I was 13 years old when I went there, and the people should realize I wasn't there 24/7. You know, I would go and come back, and very often they would come for me in the middle of the night.
How were you recruited, Steward?
Well, you know, it was almost as if I always had been part of this, because ever since childhood, you know, because of my father and his background and my family background, I was subjected to many brutal, excruciating tests as a child, as a toddler. So I was always under government supervision, government experimentation my entire life until the end of the Montauk Project. In fact, in my autobiography, Montauk Project Alien Connection, I speak about how during my childhood years, my early childhood, every Friday I would be brought to a Victorian mansion in a section of New York City, and I would be brutally examined by the doctor there, who I know now to be he was called Dr. Green, but he was Mengele.
Mengele, oh my God.
Yes, and his son was also there towards the end, and I'll never forget, I was the only patient in this huge Victorian mansion, and he would have blocks on the floor, and they would tell me to go play with the blocks, and then they would watch me behind the closed doors. They would peek out and watch what I was doing. And then would come the physical examination, which was very, very harsh and painful. I can't even begin to express it. And I would go every Friday there. And then I would be taken to a dentist's office where my teeth would be drilled and things done to my jaw without anesthesia.
Oh.
Yes, I had extreme trauma as a child. So it was ongoing, Mel. It was not like I was recruited. It's as soon as my birth. And if you read about my birth, which was also an anomaly and is in the medical books, quite frankly, it started before my birth.
So it's implied that you were recruited because your father was involved with them.
Yes, and that my creation and implantation in my mother's womb was also for that. Now remember, my father was taken to a base underneath El Paso, Texas.
Right.
When my mother went to give birth to me and they examined her, they said, it's impossible for you to be pregnant because you have no birth canal. It's sealed up. You could not physically become pregnant. They didn't know what was going on. They took her to a hospital that was not opened yet. It was under construction. There was no heat. And they brought in a doctor from Texas, same place my father was trained, and this doctor happened to be a specialist in this field, just happened to be in the area, and performed surgery on my mother so that I could be born. And this is written up in medical books.
Huh.
So I was told many years later that I was one of the first experimentations of implantation in the womb of, what do they call it, in vitro fertilization.
Right.
Yeah. So that was in the 50s.
Now, you, obviously, from what I've read, you have developed some abilities. Were these abilities developed during the project, or were they innate? Were you born with them?
Yes, I was born with them. Ever since I could remember, I saw people who went out, I now know they were dead people. I saw energy fields. I was abducted. I had alien experiences since I can remember. So yes, I do not know what it's like to have a conventional life or to have a normal childhood. I didn't really have a childhood, see. So, to me, society was a big mystery because I was never part of it.
Well, in a way, that's a positive because you were not part of that. You may have been part of one programming, but not the other programming that we are all victims of. Would you agree?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when Montauk Project ended abruptly in August 12, 1983, it was if I was unplugged from an electrical socket. It was a feeling like I had never known before. I was completely bewildered, completely out of my element. I didn't know what to do, what to say, how to interact with people. I felt actually like an alien on another planet. If I tell you that I did not even know how to put gasoline in a vehicle, I did not know how to do simple things that other people take for granted. It's quite an amazing thing. Is
it that you forgot when you were, quote-unquote, unplugged? Or you just didn't have those daily routines that most of us have?
I never had those routines. I was never shown anything, taught anything that I can say, normal quote unquote people would learn about. Even sports activities. It was foreign to me. I had no idea. How do you play baseball? What is football? I had no idea what these things were. What is popular music? I didn't know. Who's singing what groups for what? I had no idea.
A lot of people don't know this, but you were blind for a long time.
Oh, yes. Yeah, actually for 29 years.
Tell me more about this.
Well, and here again, I cannot say if they did it purposely or if it was a side effect.